In 1901, when Dad was 15 years old, he had his first piece of income. And I don't know where he got this little book, but he began to record every day that he worked and every place he worked and the amount of money he earned each day that he had a job. And he continued entering into this book until the mid-40s when his job situation stabilized until his retirement, and he didn't bother doing the daily repetition that would have been required to describe the rest of his working career. This little book is leather bound, and first entry at the top of the page, top of the first page here, cash received for labor done from September 10th, 1901. And of course he had no idea what the last entry would be 45 years later, but in any case, the first entry is $26.80 from Scott Brothers at Shawbell, which is a little mining camp west of us. And up here at the top of the entry page is a schematic of the electrical diagram for the Model T that he had. And you can see it had 4 cylinders and 4 wires coming out. But on this flap, he entered the amounts for each day and year. He didn't describe where he worked or anything. He kept the amounts, the cash amounts for every day. Then turning it around and opening the back flap, he entered the name of his employer and a description of where he worked and how many hours he worked and the rate. So the first entries were for the summation of his income, and the second was a description of the job. So you have to read from both sides of the book to get the whole story of where he worked and what he did, but it's pretty interesting. I'll read from the back page where he says that the Scott Brothers, where he earned the $26.80, he worked 33 and a half days for that. And he worked from September 10th to October 24th, 1901, and he was paid 80 cents a day. Then the next entry in his log book was in August 1904, so apparently he didn't have any income at all from October 24th, 1901 till August 1904. And there he worked 7 days for the New York Central Company at $1.35. I don't know what he did there. He doesn't say. Then he worked 4.5 days for Alphonse Coudry at $1.35. Then in May 1905, he worked 2.5 days at 95 cents a day, and he made $2.40. I see in his book here that he had typhoid fever from October 6th, 1922 to November 20th, 1922. He was out of work. And he told me that his stomach was so delicate, and apparently typhoid does affect your internal organs, that all he could eat was Jell-O for quite a while. That's the only thing that would not cause him distress. I'm not sure that the camera will show this typhoid fever. And then down here, and on the last line of the page, it shows that he worked at home from October 27th to November 25th, 23 days, where he rebuilt the house for his father. He built that house out of his own money. It shows that he only made $24.40 for December, and the note there states that he built the house for JBR. I hope that's legible. Well, that covered 23 years roughly. And that included $10 for watch repairing. In 1935, for the total year, he made $90. This page also shows his entry into the CC camps on October 23rd, 1935. He began on a 2-year enlistment. He was paid $30 a month at the CC camp, and 25 of that money was sent to Mom. He was allowed to keep $5 of it. I know that because he told me that. In 1938, he worked on the Deer Creek Road for 30 cents an hour, and it was intermittent work too. I know it was not very much time spent there. Finally, in 1940, he began to get much more consistent work on the railroad. As the war effort picked up steam, he began to work full time. And so he had 8 or 9 years of deprived income, to say the least. This copy shows the total earnings that he made from 1901 until 1930. So in 1930, he made $1,486. So his accumulated total for the time period of 1901 until 1930 was $19,444.18. The equivalence fee would be about $700. But don't forget, he was 15 when he started this book and recording earnings, and so he didn't earn very much during the 10 years following that first entry. And his income gradually increased over the years, but not by any monstrous amount. This little book has a lot of interesting details. It records the 2 years he was in the Army, and the time he went to Beauharnois, Ontario in 1912, and some vacations that he took and after the war to Little Rock, Arkansas, and New Jersey, and Florida. Although the one in Florida was not exactly vacation, it was a construction project for his brother, my Uncle Lawrence, and I'll get into that in the next video. That's a fascinating story in my view. But it shows when he had the flu in 1930, he was out for a month with it. And when he had typhoid in 1922, he was out a couple of months that time. And then the month he spent building his father a house that I've talked about before, where I was raised. But the book also tells about the period from 1931 to 1940 and the terrible lack of earnings. And the 2 years he spent in the CC camps, he made a total of about $700 in those 2 years. But that's time between 1931 and 1940 shows a total earnings for those years $1,523. So you can see from that number that the time during that Depression era was really tough. I don't know how they lived on that kind of an income, but we never went hungry, and that was the key part. And we always had shelter too. The only other income that I know he had, and he didn't record it in the book that I can see, but he got and I think it was $1,000 bonus from the government for World War I Army service. And that's what enabled him to buy that brand new 1936 and 1937 Plymouth that he really desperately needed. And I'm sure that was a tough call for him to make too, but the car he had was a total wreck, and he needed something more reliable. But in any case, I'm not going to talk any more about this book, but it's a fascinating record of the times from the early 1900s until 1945. And I don't think Dad was atypical. I think he was about average for the working man without a college degree or even a high school degree. And but he did have a skill, the ability to send Morse code on the telegraph. Jess Minuel was a cousin of Dad, and they were raised together. They were both about the same age, and both were in World War I together and remained neighbors all their lives. And so I want to recount a few events of my memory of Dad and Jess together. The earliest remembrance I have of Jess is what Dad told me about him and himself when they were kids. They used to run foot races together, and they decided that if they smeared their knees with grease, they could run faster. So I guess the belief of that enabled them to actually do it. I don't know for sure, but another incident that Dad told me about was with Jess and his brother Lawrence. Lawrence was a little younger and somewhat eccentric. He had a laugh that once you heard it, you'd never doubt who it was. Jess and Dad were the more sophisticated, I guess maybe is the word. They frequently spent time in the barn, jumping into the straw mow, like I did when I was a kid. One of the amusements I had during the summer was to climb up to a mezzanine over the barn floor, where I could get a hold of the rafters and climb up on the rafters and drop down 20 or 30 feet into the straw. And of course the straw was soft and you'd bounce 3 or 4 feet on the time of impact. Dad told me about a trick they used to pull on Lawrence. He and Jess would climb up the rafters to the peak of the roof and drop down, and Lawrence would be a little bit behind them getting up there apparently, and then they'd stand underneath where Lawrence would hit the straw, and of course Lawrence saw them underneath them, and he'd be hollering at them to get out of the way, and of course they stood there till the last moment when Lawrence couldn't hang on anymore, and then he'd let go. This mezzanine brings back another memory, totally unassociated with Jess and Lawrence, but when I was a kid, just a kid, 7, 10, something like that, somehow I heard that you could tie a string around, or a thread around a grain of corn and give it to the chickens, and they'd swallow the thing, and the thread would then be coming out of their craw, out of their mouth, and you could lead them around with a string. And I thought that was a pretty unique idea, so I did that with a chicken on the barn floor one time, and it worked more or less, but it didn't. The grain of corn wouldn't stay in the chicken. It pulled out very quickly. Memories of this mezzanine and the incidents that I've just related bring back one that I had forgotten about until now. When I was a kid, I was left to my own devices there on the farm. There wasn't anybody living nearby, any kids nearby my age, and so I was left to my own ingenuity to develop some amusement. And so I don't know how I came up with this idea, but I thought about the idea of parachuting cats from that mezzanine down to the barn floor, which was, as I said, it was about 20 feet or so. So I made a parachute out of some heavy brown paper and tied it to one of our kittens and dropped him over the side. And it was surprising how well it worked. The cat landed safely, and of course it ran for its life when it got onto the terra firma there. But I did that a number of times, and I probably spent a day fooling around with that. But it was still kind of amusing in my memory. This memory of the story that Dad told me about he and Jess and Lawrence and the straw mow brought back a memory that of my own. I made an airplane, so-called, out of some boards about 6 or 8 feet long, and made a 3-sided tube out of it, big enough for me to sit inside of it. And I nailed a cross piece of some boards to represent the wings, and a piece and the back end to represent the tail. And I decided to test flight this thing. So I got a block and tackle that we had, and I hoisted this thing about 20 feet up above the barn floor onto this mezzanine that I previously mentioned, and I balanced the thing on top of I'd say 12-inch square hand-hewn beam that ran from the front of the barn to the back under the roof there. And I carefully crawled up on the beam and got into this contraption, and I gave it a push over into the straw mow, and well, it was 15 or 20 feet above the straw when I launched, and of course it went straight down, and fortunately it threw me out and didn't give me a blow, because this thing was heavy. These old pine boards were, oh, I don't know what it weighed, but it would have been able to inflict some serious damage on my frame if it had hit me on the moment of impact. Needless to say, my first attempt at aviation didn't pan out too well. Jess and Lawrence were very devout Catholics, and Dad told me that one time when Jess and he were young, they went to confession before Mass. That was the normal way of doing things then, because it saved a trip to the church. Jess was always concerned that the priest would know who he was when he went to confession, and Dad reassured him that there was no way the priest would know who he was, since they went to confession behind the closed curtain in the confessional box, and the priest could not see who the confessor was. So Jess relied on that reassurance, and one morning Jess went to confession, and when he was done, the priest said, "Jess, I want you to serve Mass this morning." And apparently it destroyed Jess's security that the priest would not know who he was. I can't imagine that Jess, all those young guys had any serious sins, but it was kind of funny. Had to be there, I guess, to really appreciate the humor there. I remember that one time, this was when Jess and Lawrence were adults. Jess and Lawrence and Dad were religious children, young men. They maintained that throughout their lives. And one of the strictures of being a Catholic was that you didn't do unnecessary work on Sunday. Well, they obeyed that. That was the rule. There weren't any stores open or anything like that on Sundays, and only the necessary work, such as milking and feeding the cows and the animals, was done. But this one time, I remember, Jess was talking to Dad, and he was kind of excited and agitated, and he was telling the story of what had happened to his glasses. Apparently they had mown the hay early in the week, and it had dried, and they had raked it, turned it over with a rake, horse-drawn rake, and it had an opportunity to dry completely and was ready for loading onto the wagon that was drawn by a team of horses. The loading process consisted of forking it by hand onto the wagon, and a loader on the wagon redistributed the hay so that it was more dense and they could haul more hay at a load. And the hay, by Saturday, the hay was ready for hauling in, and they managed to haul a few loads on Saturday. But somehow they knew that rainstorms were going to come, perhaps on Monday, and they knew if they left the hay lie out in the field, it would get wet, and there was a danger that it would mold. So a decision had to be made, whether to work on Sunday and bring in this much needed and very valuable crop, which was used to feed the animals during the winter, or wait and take a risk and wait till Monday and get caught in the rain. So it was a serious decision, and after Mass on Sunday, they decided that they would go out and start hauling hay. And it was a hot day, too, one of those hot, humid days that can happen in Pennsylvania, a precursor for rain. So they loaded the hay pretty much on this particular load, and they stopped and took a break. They were sweating, and Jess took his glasses off and laid them on the tongue of the wagon while he wiped his face with his bandana. The guy that was working on the wagon, packing and distributing the load, climbed up on the wagon and put his foot right down on Jess's glasses. Now, Jess's glasses were fragile, typical of the day, rimless glasses with a wire frame across the top. And of course, they were made from real glass in those days, and the glasses were just crushed. Jess just went. That was an expensive monetary loss for Jess, because glasses were not cheap in those days. I suspect that he paid probably $20 for those glasses, and during the Depression, $20 was a large amount of money. And Jess just went on and on about he knew they shouldn't have gone out there and worked on Sunday, and that's the penalty he had to pay for breaking the fourth commandment, keeping holy the Sabbath day. I know Jess was thoroughly agitated for quite some time after that, self-incriminating. I remember another time we went over there, and it was during a depression, and crop prices had dropped beyond the point of even making it worthwhile to haul the crop to market. Jess was talking about this article he had seen about oranges in Florida being so worthless that the orange growers actually piled them up and threw kerosene on them to reduce the inventory and prevent people from taking them free. It's a twisted kind of logic, but when you grow a crop and it's not worth taking to market, it must be really discouraging. Not only were oranges destroyed, but so were farm animals. Pigs were slaughtered and thrown into the fields and left to rot, and cattle were also slaughtered and destroyed because of the uselessness of them and the cost to raise them. It's expensive to feed and take care of an animal. And milk, too, was dumped into the sewers because of its low selling price. People didn't have any money and couldn't buy it, so there wasn't any demand for it. And really a grim time. I was young and I had no idea of the turmoil. I didn't suffer personally because I didn't know any better. But my parents in that generation really went through hell during those years. And I'm glad I wasn't cognizant of terrible times, although I knew we didn't have any money. We never had any soft drinks or any other items that had to be purchased that were not of necessity. Jess and Dad were really good friends as well as being cousins, and Jess was the mailman, and I recall Jess bought Chevrolet cars, and I remember he had a 37 Chevy that he used to deliver the mail, and on the steering wheel he had a rubber covering that was embossed with the rosary, so as he drove he could finger the beads on the steering wheel. Jess was always anxious to talk or willing to talk, and so if I happened to be out at the mailbox, or Dad when Jess came down the hill, and we could hear him coming, so we usually went out to talk to him. He was always interesting to talk to. I know he and Dad used to get into conversations out there. Of course, it was in French, and I'd stand there with Dad just as a little kid and listen. And they always had fun talking and laughing, It was a break in the day for both of them. Getting back to Jess again for a minute, I remember Jess always smoked hand-rolled cigarettes, and he used Bull Durham, finely ground the tobacco with leaf particles in a little cloth sack. And when you bought Bull Durham, you got a sack of tobacco and a package of cigarette papers that were pre-glued. I know because I smoked quite a bit of Bull Durham myself when I couldn't afford anything else. But it was pretty good smoke, and Jess always smoked Bull Durham. But I remember seeing him roll those cigarettes with one finger and lick it quickly, and he had it all down pat. He could get the bag open, pour the tobacco and roll it up and lick it, and glue it shut, and it was quick time as I told you about it. He was a cigarette smoker too. Jess's cousin Claire Mignot was the mailman prior to Jess, and he delivered mail with a one-horse buggy with a canvas top over it and pull-down side curtains. But it must have been an awful cold ride in the winds in winter of Pennsylvania. I know he covered himself with a bearskin blanket around his waist and legs, but there was no heat, of course, in that buggy, and it was a several-hour journey to deliver the mail, so I suspect it got pretty tired of that miserable job. They decided to move to California, so they sold their house and he quit his job and they went to the Los Angeles area, as I recall. They made a return trip some years later, and I remember seeing him at the church after Mass, but I don't know whatever happened to him after that because the war began and they didn't come back as far as I know. Claire's move to California triggered a series of events that involved Mom and Dad, and I'd like to interject this here at this time. Claire was a federal employee of the post office. As a consequence, his replacement had to follow the same federal guidelines as he did when he got the job originally. And that involved a test for competency. Since unemployment was really rampant around the area and many men were out of work, and this was a steady, probably low paid, but still nevertheless was a job that a great number of men in the area really wanted. So the test was held, and Dad had decided that he would take the test too. Of all the candidates, my dad came out number one in the results, so he had the offer of the job. However, Dad was still an employee of the New York Central Railroad, and Dad had Dad had hope that he would be called back, whereas Jess had no job other than earning a living on the old homestead there by farming, which was certainly a tenuous occupation. So Dad was torn about letting Jess have the job since Jess came in number two, and of course Jess wanted the job too, but he wasn't about to do anything to step forward in front of Dad. I remember Dad and Mom talking about whether Dad ought to take that job or not, and whether Dad ought to give it to Jess, based on Dad's hopes of returning to the railroad, which is what he wanted to do anyway. But of course that didn't go overly well with Mom. She wasn't violently opposed, but of course her concern was the immediate situation versus Dad's longer range view of the issue. So I know they had several conversations, and Dad decided though to let Jess have the job. Jess stayed on the job until 1960, or 20-some years after that time. So I think this really demonstrates the character that my father had. Dad made turkey calls, and I'm going to show you one here now and roughly how it sounded. This box is made of walnut, and you can see the narrow grooves along the top edge, and if you scrape a piece of chalk across this edge, I don't have a piece of chalk available, but in any case, it creates a vibration in the sidewall. And I'm using a little stone, which is not the right texture for the vibrations to be created, but this is approximately what it sounds like. And it worked. And I know it worked because one day Dad and Jess and I went hunting for turkeys in the mountains along the river. Both Dad and Jess had seen some turkeys crossing the road several days earlier, so we organized a little hunt and began to comb the side of the mountains there along the river. And so we were separated. We could hear each other essentially, but we were out of sight, especially with Jess. He had gone up this ravine a little way and we had lost contact with him. But Dad had the turkey call and he was screeching away on that thing, and we hadn't seen anything, and all of a sudden there was a loud boom and boom, and we knew it was Jess shooting, and of course we ran in that direction, and we soon came up to where Jess was standing, and he was in a real snit. He had seen a big gobbler and fired twice, and the gobbler went down, and it was a fairly long shot, so Jess was going to establish some bragging rights by pacing off the distance to the turkey from where he had been standing when he fired. And as he approached within just a few steps from the turkey, it was completely resurrected and it was gone in a flash. And if you've ever seen a turkey move at top speed, you'll understand how quickly that turkey disappeared into the woods. Far quicker than Jess could get his gun out and do any more shooting at it. And the words that Jess used are not fit for reproduction at this time. He was swearing in French, of course, and he was just well, it was funny then, and it's funny now. He was a good guy, and but he was really disappointed in the foolishness of not coming as quickly as possible and inflicting the coup de grace on that turkey before it had a chance to change its mind and get out of sight. But anyway, that was the end of the turkey hunt. We didn't see another turkey the rest of the day. I remember one time Dad and I went hunting down near Carthus along the river, and we were hunting turkey, and we were separated. You have to separate in order to. You're not out for a stroll in the woods. Let's put it this way, that way. So I hadn't seen anything, and I'd lost sight of Dad, but I heard some noise coming through the brush. It was dry, and the leaves were cracking under the feet of whatever was coming. I wasn't sure if it was turkey or not. Loud as the brush underfoot was, it could very well have been turkey. So there was a low hanging pine tree right next to me. So I immediately crawled underneath the pine tree out of sight, and I waited for the sounds to approach me. Pretty soon I saw the nicest buck I have ever seen. He was 10 or 12 points, the best I could see. Beautiful animal, but it was not deer season, and of course we were 7 or 8 miles from home, and I wasn't going to try any fancy footwork with an illegal deer. So I waited, and I could see him approaching me, and he had no idea I was hiding under the tree. And he marched up really within maybe 10 or 15 feet, and he stopped. And he lifted his head, and he knew there was something not quite right, but he couldn't put his so-called finger on it. And he kept sniffing, and he had his head raised, his nose was up in the air, and he was really trying to figure it out. So I decided to have a little fun with him. So I pointed my gun straight up in the air and I fired. I'll tell you that that was cruelty in animals. I'll tell you the fright that he had and the speed that he disappeared into the woods was it was. I thought it was pretty funny at the time, but I wasn't too bright in reality. So Dad heard me shoot, and he came up. He thought I had a shot at it, but he didn't say much when I told him what I'd done. But a short time later, we had separated again, and I heard him call to me and told me there were birds flying over the tops of the trees. So I looked up, and there were 4 or 5 turkeys flying directly overhead. But these trees were pretty tall, and they just looked like B-29s flying overhead, flapping their wings in graceful motions. It's really, they're a beautiful bird, and when you see them flying, they look pretty large. Well, they are fairly large birds, but anyway, I fired a few shots up in the air at them, but I knew I was wasting my ammunition. But I did shoot one time on the hill south of our house, up on the top of that grade there. I was up there with a shotgun one day, and gosh, there were several turkeys, hens, and a gobbler. I almost stepped on them. They never saw me, and they're really a wary bird, and they're alert to their surroundings. So I was really amazed at how close I got. In fact, when they saw me, we saw each other about the same time, and of course they immediately took flight, and but I was pretty fast with my shotgun, and I fired at the gobbler, and I got him, and I took him home and defeathered him, and I was really a little disappointed at the size of his body. There were so many feathers on him, he looked like a monster, but in reality he was probably he wasn't much bigger than a chicken if he was that large. But that's the only turkey I ever got. I shot at a lot of them, and there were a lot of turkeys around that area, but they're a difficult animal to hunt and to kill. So in the years past, they've introduced coyotes, and they're really a plague on turkeys. So the turkey population is reduced since I was a kid. I never heard Mom sing, and Dad either, except with one time I remember when I was pretty small. He did sing a song, or a few lines of a song that he had learned from his father, and of course it came from France. And I can't sing, but I'm going to try to repeat what he said this one time, and I don't know why I remember this, but the song goes something like this. Il veut Jésus, il veut sa croix. And that's all I remember. And the translation is that he wants Jesus, he wants his cross. That's a little tidbit, that one of the rare things that I can really know that came from France in 1835. Well, I think it's time for this one to end.